Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast, where hope matters. I'm Jimmy Hinton.
And I'm Clara Hinton, and we're so glad that you've joined us.
If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Well, thank you for joining us today for this podcast. Today we're going to talk about reporting and why it's so difficult to report. And we're going to share our story and kind of the story of discovery and what led us to report my father whenever allegations of abuse arose. First, I want to start off by telling people that you may have seen some of the statistics out there, and it's quite troubling, to be honest. But I was just looking at an article from 10 years ago. Time did an article, and they talked about how few people who are even mandated reporters report abuse. And they said that physicians reported in their study, they reported suspicion of abuse when they were almost positive that kids had marks that were consistent with abuse. They reported only 6% of the time. I had read some studies on school teachers, and I don't remember what the statistics were. Keep in mind, they're mandated reporters as well, and they very rarely report suspicions of abuse. I think those numbers shrink even more dramatically when you get into the religious community, because we come up with all kinds of colorful excuses for why we shouldn't report somebody. So we want to talk about that, and I don't want to take the assumption that most of the people out there don't care or that they approve of children being abused. I think there's something much deeper at play. And as somebody who reported my own father and my mom, who's also recording this podcast, she also reported. She was with me whenever we went to the police station. So she was reporting her ex-husband, my father, and we're going to talk about that.
We sure are. And for those of you that are listening, I know these statistics sound maybe outrageously wrong. We can't imagine that people like teachers and physicians would almost be 100% assured that abuse is going on, yet only 6% report this. And I'm sure we sit here thinking, no, it can't be. But I think by the time Jimmy and I finish disclosing our account of reporting, you'll get a better picture of why that is the truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think maybe we can start off by sharing a little bit of the I call it the process of discovery, how we found out and kind of the sequence of events. And so I'll let you talk first, because you initially received an email exchange, I think, that was forwarded to you, and I ended up reading that same email exchange when one of those victims scheduled an appointment at the church building to come up and speak with me in person.
Right. I well remember the night when I was sitting in my office and I was finishing up work for the evening. I do a lot of grief work, and I was just getting ready to shut my computer down when I saw an email that came through, and I knew the person that had sent this email. So, and I looked at the subject line, and it said, description of a pedophile. And I remember just sitting there staring at that, and I thought, description of a pedophile. Many of you will probably find this hard to believe, but I was not sure what a pedophile was. At that time, the word wasn't used publicly much at all. I had no reason to use it in my own language, so I opened the email and began reading it, and it was just a list of 20 items that described a pedophile. And at the bottom of that email was a short message saying, I am the victim of John's abuse. And I just remember being stunned. That's all. Stunned. I sat there frozen, not believing what I was reading. But because if you've read my blog at all from the beginning, you will understand that there were a lot of odd things that had been happening that I'll call red flags. And I know we can't base a pedophile on red flags only, but there were a lot of odd things that happened that last year when John and I were separated, that just raised question upon question that didn't make sense. Suddenly, things made sense. I immediately called the girl that reported this to me, and we talked until the wee hours of the morning, and it was after that I turned this information over to Jimmy and asked this young lady to go see Jimmy.
So the way that I remember, of course, it's been almost 7 years now, but if I remember correctly, you had either emailed or called me and didn't say anything about the email. You said that I should be expecting a phone call from somebody who wanted to come up and talk to me.
Right.
Right. And so I didn't know. I just knew that it sounded serious in nature, and that was all I knew.
Right.
So sure enough, and I remember the date. It was July 29th. I remember it was a Friday. Those dates stick in your mind because they're life-changing. That was a life-changing day. And so this young woman had called me, I think it was in the morning, and just asked if she could come up and talk to me that day. And so I scheduled an appointment, and it was in the afternoon, and she came up, and I just remember the look on her face. I mean, it's etched in my brain forever. And, it's just sheer terror. And she was holding something in her hand, and it was an email correspondence between her and another adult female, where apparently they had been, when they were kids, they had been in the same place at the same time, and they both were abused by my father. And so I was reading this email exchange between them, and I just remember, it's that sucker punch feeling to the gut where your whole world comes crashing down in a matter of seconds. And I just felt like vomiting, and it's all kinds of emotions just raging to the surface. And and my experience was the same as yours. It was just this light bulb aha moment where thousands of weird memories just flooded into my brain all within milliseconds, and it just made sense.
Well,
it just
right.
Intuitively it made sense.
And for people who have not read my blog, which gives a lot of the information that Jimmy and I are talking about, these weird things, a lot of that was that John, when we separated, I call it, he just went hog wild with his actions. He had freedom now to do what he wanted. He was a male nanny. He was babysitting lots of young children, which made no sense to me. He was picking these kids up, taking them on swimming excursions. He had his own grandchildren, he had his own family, but he was choosing to spend time with community children. And it just didn't make sense. He would buy them gifts, he would load them into his car, take them out to eat. And the final weirdness was he was keeping some of these kids overnight with him, which...
But we still, at that time, we weren't thinking, gee, I wonder if he's molesting those kids.
No,
and it's amazing how blind you are, how blatantly blind you are to the abuse that's right in front of you. And I talk about this a lot when I do seminars. It's because we don't want to believe that that's true about somebody, and so that becomes our new reality. And so you become very blinded to all the signs that are blatantly in front of your face,
right.
And they were.
And I think more than ever thinking that he was molesting children, that was the furthest thing I know from my mind. He was kind, he was generous, he was fun, he was this person that kids always were attracted to. And from my standpoint, I was angry with him, and I told him so. I said, you have your own grandkids that you're not spending time with. Why are you doing this with kids that you don't even know? Why? Mm-hmm. Why would you pass up time with family when you're going around doing that?
He always had a very smooth answer.
He did.
And
he did.
He explained it away where it just made sense, and you just didn't question it anymore.
Right. He was helping the lonely.
And I want people to realize that it's not like he acted weird or or acted uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. No.
He had an answer for everything, and framed it in a way that it just made sense, and it was very believable
answers. Absolutely.
So I remember reading this email exchange, and I just looked up, and she had her head buried in her arms, and she was just crying, and I looked up, and I'll never forget what I said to her, and in that moment, I said, I believe you, and I said, I don't know what this is going to look like. I don't know, I was only 2 years into my job as a full-time minister. I was hired in June, 2 years prior, June of 2009. This was July of 2011, so literally 2 years and 1 month after I was hired. That gets thrown into your office, and your whole world blows up, and it's your own father.
Another thing I just want to put in here is right now, this is so public. Every day we're reading in the newspapers about more and more people being arrested for child abuse. It's commonplace right now. 7 years ago, it was not. It was very quiet. You didn't hear this kind of stuff. So we had nothing to base anything on. It was shock, the shock of all shocks. It truly, truly was.
Yeah.
You weren't thinking in that direction. Mm-mm. You weren't thinking at all about that. Neither one of us were.
So I told her, I said, I don't know what this looks like, and I don't know. I said, as far as my job, I don't know, and I happen to be, I have the misfortune of being at the church where my dad preached for 27 years. So I'm preaching at my home congregation. It's the congregation that I grew up in. I went into ministry because of him. So, he was, when you hear that an abuser was the pillar of the community, that's not people just being stupid. These abusers really are. He was highly respected in our community, highly respected, not just by our community, but by his own family. If I ever had any ministry questions, I went to him. He was always the first person I went to. So, I just told her in that moment, I said, I don't know what this looks like. I don't know what it looks like for me and my wife. I don't know what it looks like for my job here. But one thing I can guarantee you, it stops now. And so, there wasn't really much more that we could say in that moment. And so, she left, and I called you immediately after she left. And I said, so I'm picking up that you're kind of aware of what's going on. And I said, what are your thoughts? And if I remember, you just countered the question, what are your thoughts? Right. And we both kind of simultaneously said, we know exactly what we have to do. And it wasn't even a question that we were going to report it to the police. We never, you and I never argued. We never debated.
No.
We both
knew
that we had to go to the police. We had to go to the police. Now it just became an issue of when. That was on a Friday afternoon. My wife was teaching in the public school at the time. It was 30 minutes before she got home from work, so I had 30 minutes to process what I had just been told. I was absolutely devastated. My wife came home and she said, "You look terrible." And I said, "There's a reason why." And so I told her what I'd been given, and it was probably 30 minutes after I shared that with my wife, I was out the door doing a wedding rehearsal for one of our church members. And so you can imagine the range of emotions, because I walked in and they were all bubbly and, they're happy and they're this young couple and they're getting married and life is just wonderful. And I had just been sucker punched with the worst news of my life. And so I had my mind was a million miles away from that wedding rehearsal. So the next day was Saturday, the day of the wedding, and I hadn't slept the night before, and my mind was all over the map. So I end up doing the wedding, and I still to this day don't remember anything about that wedding except the reception after the wedding. We're sitting at a table. We have assigned seats. We're at a round table. To my left is my wife. To the right is the victim who disclosed to me just the day before. And directly across the table from us is, guess who?
I just, as you're saying this, Jimmy, and you're talking about the range of emotions and all that you went through, to this day, as your mother, I do not know how you withstood that. I have no idea, except by the hand of God that you were able to stand up and function, albeit that you don't remember any words that you said at that wedding. I just don't know how you did it. I really don't.
Yeah.
I do not.
At that point, he didn't know. So that, Saturday I was just consumed with this. Well, then Sunday I get up and I had to preach. I taught Bible class, and then I had to preach. I was not in the frame of mind, and we still hadn't been to the police yet. And so as I'm preaching, I look out, and guess who's looking back at me? He was there that Sunday.
Right.
And he's sitting listening to me preach. And then Monday, you and I went to the police station.
We did.
And I still remember, and I want to talk about that because I don't know about you, but I know for me, I just felt absolutely like I was betraying him, and like I almost felt bad for him at that point. Even though I knew what he did was wrong, and I knew it had to be reported, I didn't know how many victims he potentially had. And it's still in the back of your mind, and your mind does these crazy things in those moments, and I think this is why so few people report, because I'm looking for a way out. In my mind, I'm thinking of a justification that maybe they were misunderstood, maybe it wasn't really abuse, maybe it was just, it was something that happened that made them uncomfortable, but it wasn't really abuse. Your mind does all kinds of crazy things to try to process that this is the person who I loved and adored for all of my life.
That was your dad who taught you everything spiritual that you learned as a child.
Yeah.
That was your dad you went in the woods with him, camping and hiking, spent hundreds of hours with your dad, laughing, telling jokes. He was a super dad. He truly was. And how do you separate such knowledge as you were hit with, and look at your dad and say, of course you're going to say, it can't be. It cannot be. Of course. That was natural, Jimmy. That's normal. What's not normal is your ability to go to the police and report that. That was...
Yeah, well, both of us. And still to this day, it was never a thought to not go to the police. That was never even hinted at in my own mind. I can't speak for you, but in my mind...
It was not.
Did I think, I'm not going to go to the police, or so when I talk about this justification and kind of quote unquote looking for a way out, that's just part of the processing. You've been given something that's diametrically opposed to everything that you know to be true about that person, and you've got to process that, and it's hard. It is absolutely life changing. That's the other thing that we wanted to talk about is
it's traumatic. It really
you know
is.
That when you step over the threshold into that police station, that your life will never be the same, regardless of how the investigation unfolds.
I remember at that point, of course, John and I were not together. Once again, if you read the blog, my blog, findingahealingplace.com, I explain how that happened. But it's still, this was my husband for almost 40 years. This is the man I married. This is the man that was my spiritual leader. This is the father of all my children. And how do you separate that? I just remember crying throughout that entire weekend, sobbing, running everything through my mind. You know, it's just like you run years and years and years of events through your mind, and you say, no, this can't be. Well, yes, it can be. No, this can't be. Yes, it can be. You don't know. It is horrible what our minds mixed with our emotions.
I don't know about you, but through that weekend, I was the same thing. Just thousands of memories.
Right.
Just being obliterated in my mind. Just all these emotions and memories. They're all surfacing like crazy. But over that weekend, I could not get away from the good memories.
Well, I was just going to say,
those actually became haunting to me.
It's weird because I journaled through that. From the second I learned this, I began journaling. That's my therapy. Same here. Mm-hmm. Your dad fixed me breakfast every morning. You know that. Mm-hmm. Served it to me. He did not raise his voice to me. Mm-hmm. He treated you kids awesome. He taught you kids how to respect me. Mm-hmm. And my mind went all but crazy. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't think of bad, horrible memories. And that is almost, in a way, way worse. Would have been way better if I could have thought, could have remembered him being horribly ugly and terrible and mean and just this vicious person. It wasn't like that.
Yeah.
Was not like that.
Yeah, and I think
at all.
I think that's why it's just so hard for people to report, because they're not reporting. We hear this stuff. We hear this stuff about, well, if you see something, say something, and it just doesn't work that way. People are not reporting a stranger. They're not reporting an object. You will be reporting your best friend, and that was the truth bomb in the previous episode.
Right.
You will be reporting somebody who you love, who you adore, who you will not be able to wrap your mind around the reality that person is an abuser. And I remember talking to Rick Brashler. He's with Kanaka Camps. Some of you may recognize that name. Rick Brashler developed a really good training with Kanaka Camps because they had so many cases of abuse, and they had developed policies because of lawsuits, and they were trying to get a grip on this and figure out how these abusers were getting into their camps and abusing all these little kids. So he sits down and writes this policy with his coworker at their headquarters in Branson. Come to find out that guy gets arrested. The guy who helped Rick co-write his policy gets arrested for sexual abuse of minors. And Rick said that he was absolutely devastated. And he's like, how did this man who was sitting across the table from me and who was my best friend and who he was in a time when we were in crisis and we had to develop this policy and we had all these lawsuits that were, brought against the camp. This guy was my helper. And here he was sexually abusing kids himself.
Right now, because of all we know, we can believe this. And we're not shocked as we were 7 years ago.
No.
7 years ago, we didn't have the information available to us that we have now. But I'm not sure that would have made a difference, though, because this man, your father, was loved. He was your hero. He was the hero to many. The entire community loved him, and I will say to this day, 7 years later, I still get people in the community who will come up to me and say, I am so sorry for what happened to John. They still cannot wrap their minds around this man who helped literally hundreds of people in this community, helped put their marriages back together, helped children get into college, helped counsel young people and adults.
And successfully saved marriages.
He did.
He did. I mean, was generous with his time, with his money, with
everything.
And he was.
Yes. Everything. Yes.
So, yeah, I remember shortly after he was arrested, I'd say hands down by far the most common question that I was getting asked by people in our community, by people in the church, was, how's your dad doing?
Yeah.
And I just remember that was my first experience into this phenomenon where people in the religious community side with the abuser. And I to this day, I only remember two people asking how his victims were.
Right.
I only remember two people asking me that. I remember dozens of people asking me, how's your dad doing? How's he doing?
Because people loved him. They truly, truly did. And what you mentioned before, it's just so out of place to believe this about somebody that you love and adore. And who's treated you wonderfully, by the way.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I remember, we were speaking in hypotheticals in the police station, and I want to be completely transparent about that. It's not like we just marched in there and we were like, my dad and you, my ex-husband, we have physical evidence, which we actually brought into, you had brought that email exchange into the police station.
I did, yes.
And I remember we sat down with the detective who I'm good friends with. I drove truck with her cousin for over a year, and I did both of his sons, so it'd be her nephews. I performed their weddings. And so, she was, the detective on this case is a good friend, and, I trust her, you trusted her.
I trusted her, I worked with her husband.
Yeah, and just wonderful, wonderful lady. And I remember being offended because she was so hard on Dad in that interview, and she said, just very matter of fact, she goes, cut the crap.
Yeah.
She said, you didn't drive all the way down here, and you're not wasting my time, and you're certainly not wasting your time to sit here and talk about hypotheticals. Who are you talking about? And she said, we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. She said, the easy way is you give me a name. The hard way, she said, I'll go as far back in time as I possibly can. I will interview every person who you've ever talked to, and I will find out eventually who you're talking about.
And she, by the way, is not your typical person that you go to when you report. She's
pretty hardcore.
She's hardcore, but she also cares.
She does,
deeply,
and she's still, when I run into her, she asks how all of his victims are, and she asks by name. She will go right down through his victims, and by name.
Yes.
She still remembers their names, and she will ask by name how they're doing. She's incredible. But yeah, we just wanted, we wanted to share that with people, because I think even with the Larry Nassar case, that, some of that was covering up for the organizations. There's no question about that. But there's another component to that where some of these people, the investigative team at MSU, they chose people who are friends and colleagues to Larry Nassar. Like, the last people who they should have asked to investigate him were the first people who they asked. So that was botched from start to finish.
Right.
But part of the reason why some of those people didn't turn on Larry Nassar was because I think they literally didn't believe that Larry Nassar had abused any of those
victims. For the very reasons we talked about here.
Yeah. He was their friend. Reasons. He was their mentor. He was their peer. These were people who loved and adored Larry Nassar.
Well, when you work side by side with a person and you see so much good coming from them, and then you learn of this different life, it's a trauma. It truly is.
Yeah.
It's extremely hard to shift your mind and heart.
Yeah. So we'll talk more about kind of what happened after that, because that's just barely scratching the surface. There's so much that happened within the next even 3-4 days after that.
Right.
They were just,
right.
It was one devastating thing after the other. And, just so much trauma within our family. And, there was the process of telling my siblings, the rest of your children.
Yes.
A 2-week period where he was still out and hadn't been arrested yet. So he knew that we knew. He didn't know that we were the ones who reported him, so there was just this awkward thing. He had called me up to confide in me after the police first called him and pulled him in for questioning. I mean, just so many components to this.
I think it's so important that our listeners understand that even though for us it seemed like, right away we need to go report this, there was no hesitation in anything, that it should be easy. It was not easy. It was horrendous. In the back of your mind, you know that your life, as Jimmy said in the very beginning of this podcast, is never going to be the same again. Once you open that can and let that truth out, nobody's life within your family is ever going to be the same again. This was not only going to affect our family, it affected the church, it affected the community, it reached far and wide, and I think it deserves special attention, a special session just to
I agree, and
that.
I kind of use the analogy of a tidal wave, because there were so many events that happened so quickly, but it wasn't just one tidal wave. One tidal wave comes and then it's gone.
Right.
This was tidal wave after tidal wave after tidal wave, and we were getting demolished.
Right.
And I just remember thinking at one point, very shortly after you and I had walked into that police station, I thought, how much more can we take?
Right.
It just got to this point where it was unbearable.
Well,
it was literally unbearable.
And stress does things to people. Your minds go crazy. Your body feels weak. You can't eat. You don't think of the physical aspect either. And I think just the mental toll, the emotional toll. You had a church to tend to yet. Mm-hmm. All of this was going on. These were people that loved and adored your dad for years. I had a whole tribe of children to deal with, and the emotions that went with that was unbelievable. Mm-hmm. But we'll save that for the next time.
Yeah. So we'll end with a truth bomb, and before we do that, I will say, as clearly as I can say it, if I were to go back, would I do it all over again? Absolutely, 100%. The cost of reporting was definitely worth it.
Absolutely, I will. I'm right there
I have
with
no
you, Jimmy.
hesitation.
Yeah, no.
As devastating as it was,
right.
I have absolutely zero regrets that you and I reported
absolutely.
that day. None.
Absolutely. No, me neither.
So the truth bomb that we'll leave you with today is that you have got to learn how to detach yourself emotionally from the person you love in order to see the facts objectively, in order to make a report. If you remain emotionally attached to that person, that's when all the excuses start flooding in. It could be not him, he's just so full of love, the good outweighs the bad. There's just, I could think of so many things that would get in the way of you actually walking into the police station or picking up the phone and making that report. You've got to learn to detach yourself emotionally from that person so that you can look at the facts very objectively, and that is not an easy thing to do.
It's not easy, but it's necessary, and the reward comes at the end of the day. It truly, truly does. When you know you have stood up for those victims of abuse.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for tuning in for this episode. As always, thank you for tuning in to the Speaking Out on Abuse podcast with Jimmy and Clara Hinton. You can subscribe to the podcast through either of our websites, findingahealingplace.com, jimmyhinton.org, or through iTunes. Please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode.